it's too early. So we very much appreciate that you are here with us. As I said yesterday evening, we will continue this morning the discussion which we had yesterday with some distinguished faculties at Bard. And we'll focus today on another subject, or a more narrow, or even broader if you want, subject, which is Hannah and Rosa, the film which Margarethe von Trotta did about Rosa Luxemburg, and the film on Hannah Arendt, which she projects to do it in the future, in, let's hope, next future. I don't think it's necessary to present her again. She is a very famous and brilliant artist, a great, as I said yesterday, explorer of the modern soul, not only of the woman's soul, and not necessarily a feminist artist, but a real great modern artist. We are very honored to have our president here next to me. Pamela Katz is the scenarist of Margarethe von Trotta, and Roger Berkowitz, our colleague at Bard, is the guy who was essential in putting together these events. We think that first, perhaps, our guest would say a few words, what she intends to do about this new film, and what kind of connection she sees between these two characters, Rosa Luxemburg, which was a fighter and a thinker, and Hannah Arendt, who in another town, in other conditions, was rather a thinker, and even if her thinking was very combative. So I would ask Margarethe to tell us a few things.
I have to thank you also for coming, because for us it's also early, so it's not only for you. No, that to put these two persons together, or these two thinkers or fighters, that was an idea here of the college. It was not mine from the beginning, but because I don't make series of people or films about one important woman or thinker or fighter, and then I make, that was not in my mind to give a theory. That happened, that I did Rosa Luxemburg, that was already in 85, so that was still a time in Germany where she was very much appreciated in the East German country, but in West Germany she was not very loved. And I remember there was still a stamp, once they put out a stamp in West Germany with her image, with her portrait on, and some of the people which received letters with this stamp, personal letters, only with this stamp with her image on, they refused to accept these letters. So you can imagine what a hatred it was still in between some people in our West German country against her. So that was for me also a reason why to interest me for this woman. And the first time I met her, for me is always very important as a filmmaker, in what condition or in what moment I meet somebody. And Rosa Luxemburg, I met her, as to say, met her, I couldn't meet her because she was dead, but in these demonstrations, 68 in Berlin, if you remember, all the students were carrying around portraits of Lenin and Marx and Ho Chi Minh, and in between was only one woman, and that was Rosa Luxemburg. And impressed me, or it makes me wonder that all these male portraits were so, self-contained and so very, very much male. And she had such a sad face. Her portrait was as if it was a veil of sadness over. And knowing that she was a revolutionary, I didn't know her so well. Then I started to interest me for her. But that was this. Knowing she was one thing and seeing her face and it with this sadness on. That was the first, how do you say, point of. And then Fassbinder was supposed, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, you know him perhaps, he's one of the most well-known filmmakers of the 70s and early 80s. And he was supposed to make a film about her. And he already wrote a script. You knew that, Robert? Yes, and then he died before he could do the film. And the producer then came up to me and said, please do the film, because he was a friend of yours, and it's even better you do it because you are a woman and you have the responsibility to do it. I was very hesitating because if a friend dies and just to get up to his project, it was for me a little bit like Leichenfledderei. How do you say that in English? But then I started to read and to really to go deeper in her life and her scripts, and then, since I was also a leftist still in these times, I have to apologize because
I don't have anything.
Yeah.
It's okay. You should stay there.
Okay. And in the same time we had in the early 80s there were big peace movement in our country, and it was on both sides, also in East Germany, because in this time of the Cold War there were still the missiles of the Russians. They were positioned in East Germany, and the missiles of the Americans in West Germany. So we would have been the first, if there would have been a war, to be destroyed totally, even if perhaps it would have been a late punishment for what we did before. So in a way, mentally we had to accept that, but not our children. My son in these times said, "Oh, we will be the first generation not to die by the normal death." So they saw it like that, like a real danger. So, and she was during the First World War. She was a heavy fighter against war. She was an internationalist, so she was speaking out very loudly and very strongly against war, and even she was put in jail during the whole wartime of this First World War, because they were so afraid that she would speak and insist or inspire people to be against war, that she was, without having done nothing, she was in Sicherheitsverwahrung, how do you say, for the security, let's say, of the state. They put her in jail. And so there were so many points that for me in this very moment were important for Germany. And then to get closer to her, and that is for a filmmaker, it's you can't only make a film about somebody with only the theoretical scripts or her speeches, or you have to go, and all the biographies I I read, there were only her political thinking, only her political and theoretical and also career, and only Paul Nettelbeck, Paul Nettel. It was the only biography I found where I could also feel a little bit of her personality and of her emotions, her feelings, her being with, for instance, her companion Leo Jorgicius. And there comes also a point together with, I switch over to Hannah Arendt. That was her first really lover, or her first friend and companion and lover, and she never loved another person more than him. So it's like Heidegger and Hannah Arendt then, in a certain way. But then I tried to get closer to her, and she left 2,500 letters. She was a big, really letter scriber, or how do you say it, Briefschreiberin, yeah. And she wrote wonderful letters. And in her letters, she had often a very poetic and very warm-hearted style. So she could be hard like a knife or sharp like a knife when she spoke to her politician companion or to her party members, or against Bebel, for instance, against the prosecutor who put her in jail then, or the judge who put her. She could be intellectually so sharp and also hurting, also very witty sometimes, but so that I could even understand that the members of the Social Democratic Party didn't like her all so much, because and that is also a point, I think, with Hannah Arendt, that she was sometimes not so appreciated because of her sharp intelligence. That's only a bio thing, but in these letters, 2,500, I read them 5 times without making notes, and I thought what then afterwards I could remember, that would be the thing I'm interested in, what had something to do with me. And then, sure, I read all the other stuff, but there I could find her as such a warm-hearted friend also for her friends. And when they came to visit her in prison, to console her that she was in prison, and then they went away being consoled themselves. So she had this gift to really to listen also, and to really to feel compassion with others. And so these both sides that were interesting for me. If she would have been only the fighter and only this sharp sharp person, I wouldn't have had this wish to go deeper in her personality. So that's for Rosa Luxemburg. Then now perhaps you can add.
I'm taken with the image of the posters on the street that you saw when
Yes.
you first encountered Rosa.
Yes.
Amongst Ho Chi Minh and Lenin and others. You said, I forget exactly who was there. Which is one of the, I mean, not how I first encountered her, but the way that she first made an impression on me was in Hannah Arendt's book, Men in Dark Times, where amongst the 9 men, one of the 9 is a woman, Rosa Luxemburg, where I first sort of encountered her in my own thinking. And what always struck me most about this essay that Arendt wrote about Luxemburg there is where she says that the decisive question of politics is whether one has moral contempt for the middle class and for society. And what she basically says is that the other members of the German social democratic movement were more interested in being part of a party and being and having, in a sense, had contempt for society and wanted to set themselves against the society. Whereas what Rosa Luxemburg had was a moral love to change society through an involvement in the world. But both Rosa and Hannah Arendt are people who have, Hannah Arendt talks about being an intentional pariah, standing outside of society and yet also in it in some way. And Rosa Luxemburg, she talks about as someone who knew that you needed to have constant friction with society to have any chance to change it. So I'm wondering, it's interesting that you're attracted to these two women, both of whom chose not to have children.
No, they didn't choose.
Well, Hannah Arendt.
Rosa wanted to have children, and her lover Jurgisches, he was against children because he said, you have to make the revolution, and your children are your ideas, and you have not the right to have children because then you are not daring anymore so much with children. You have to be caring the children, and you can't go outside to take risks. So she would have liked, and I think also Hannah Arendt, it was not her choice. She said in one moment that they couldn't have because of the times, of the dark times.
Mm-hmm.
So I think she would have been a good mother.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm just...
You don't know, but you have a child, so why not have...
Well, there's a quote from Hannah Arendt where she says, when we were young, we were too poor, and then we were old, then we were too old.
That's somewhat of an excuse.
No, I don't think so. I think that my own impression from her is that, when my older brother was born in 1941, in Switzerland, my mother was a physician, slightly younger than Hannah. The doctors and nurses said openly to her, "You must be crazy to have a Jewish child. What are you doing this for? You're condemning this child to death.
Yeah.
You have no right to do it." So you understand the environment from 1933. By the time, so Hannah was born in 1906. So by the time she and Heinrich he would have been a terrible father. But so maybe that's why she used restraint. But by the time actually she would have felt comfortable, let's say 46, she was already 30. What? She was 34. Yeah. Now, she was in the United States and couldn't earn a living. This image of Hannah Arendt as a successful woman in America is nonsense. Yeah. She was a pariah. No academic institution would give her a job because faculty committees considered her to be not a real academic.
And she was still stateless also.
She was no. By that time, she was already. By the time that she was in America in the late 40s, she couldn't get a real academic job. Her entire life, she never got a real line. Oh, I see my colleagues here. A tenure track job at a university or college, not available to her. No American academic, she would never have gotten a job, and she didn't. She didn't. And the real irony was when they offered her the Schweitzer chair at the end of her career in New York, she laughed. The only reason she got it was because she was a woman. They were desperate to find women. And like Rosa Luxemburg, she never identified herself primarily, interestingly, as a woman. She would have been amazed by the feminist embrace of her. The other thing is...
She got that to Clara Zetkin. Clara Zetkin was there in the party for the women questions, and she didn't want to...
And for the International Day of the Woman, Clara Zetkin.
There's a whole I don't know whether you found it making the film, a whole subculture of women in the communist movement. And a subject all its own. But the interesting thing is that this moral thing you talk about is absolutely... It's at the core of her controversy with Lenin. It's one thing to be opposed to Babel, but to Lenin, to take him on, took real. But I'm curious, what do you? The relationship with Liebknecht and the posthumous reception of Liebknecht. because they were both killed together, as you know. So
yes,
how does that compare? How do the two of them, in your experience?
How compare?
Yeah, the reputation. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg, is there the same, what's the memory of Karl Liebknecht?
He's not so well known. They have both their street names in East Berlin, and perhaps Liebknecht for the Germans were a little bit more comprehensible and more they felt more close to him. But that is because Rosa was a woman and she was Jewish.
And she was Polish.
And she was Polish.
The other
and
thing
she always spoke with a slight Polish accent.
Right.
So
she wasn't really fully German, which is why she was Jewish and Polish.
No, she was against the Germans. She came... Yeah, my mother was also against Germany. I could understand that because they are so stiff and so. But she came. She wanted to come to Germany because in these times the most important social democratic party, who was supposed then to go on to revolution, was the German. And she did a fake marriage in Switzerland with a German, only to become the German nationality, to have the right then to go to Germany to fight in the party.
Yeah, Hannah was much more German than Rosa Luxemburg.
Yes.
Because she was and Hannah had a real prejudice against Eastern European Jews.
I know, yeah.
And
that
so,
was
of which Rosa Luxemburg was of the greatest.
But on the other hand, Rosa was never interested to say, I'm Jewish and I have a Jewish background, and for her, the Jewish religion was not important at all. She was an internationalist and she was a fighter on this Marxistic theory to go on and to
change every anti-Semite, that is the mark of being Jewish. Precisely that ideology gives you away.
Yeah, but Hannah she also always was positive about her Jewish, no?
Oh yes,
yeah.
But she was never a Marxist.
No, and she lived after Hitler. That is, I think, the big contrast.
Rosa died before.
No, I have just a small story too. But when I showed Rosa Luxemburg in Ann Arbor, and there were so many Jewish students also in the university, and in my film, Rosa Luxemburg had a Christmas tree. And and they were attacking me and saying, "Oh, you're terrible." And she was a Jew, and she never could have a Christmas tree. And then I went to Arnheim, who was still living in Ann Arbor. I told him that they were so aggressing me because of this Christmas tree, and he said, "But we all had Christmas trees."
Listen, on the first exhibition in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, that terrible building I can't stand by Liebeskind, terrible thing. Anyway, I went with my children, and this was a resume of the history of Jews in Germany. And this was such an embarrassment. It ended, by the way, with a film clip of Hannah Arendt in a conversation on German television.
Günter Gauss.
Yeah, with Günter Gauss. Yeah, so, this rolling video thing. But so I'm going through the thing, and I make a left turn. There is a recreation of a typical Jewish home in Germany, and it has a Christmas tree in it.
Yeah.
And so they told a story of exceptionalism and assimilation, as if that was it was totally, it was on many counts offensive, the whole thing. But you're absolutely right. They showed all the school children, buses of German school children, the story of the Jews, which no longer exist in Germany, and there is this Tannenbaum in the middle of, to show we didn't have to kill them because they were just like you and me, so which is actually true. There was a Christmas tree.
Yeah. No, therefore, for me, when I did a film on Rosa, it was also when she was killed. With the acceptation of the Social Democrats, no?
Oh, they organized it.
Yes, but not very openly. But yeah, and for me, she was the first Jew being killed in Germany. So that was also woman and Jew, and then came up all the story, the terrible story that came after. Yeah, no.
I'd like to know, with Rosa Luxemburg, there's a story, there's a revolution, and there's her death that one is leading towards, and we all know it, and it sort of has a narrative to it. I'm wondering for both of you, as writers of a movie on Hannah Arendt that I assume will have a narrative, what's the story that one tells of her life?
It's Pam to answer.
Well, that was certainly a challenge, and it was the first thing that Margarethe said to me when she said that she was interested in focusing on Hannah Arendt, and I insisted on being involved. She said, but she's a thinker.
She's what?
She's a thinker, so what are we going to show? And is it on? Hello, hello? Can you hear me? The system, all right, can you hear me?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, I live in Brooklyn, so I can shout. So it was a difficult question with Hannah Arendt, not because she didn't have a fantastic life that was very interesting, that she was a student, as most of you here know, of Heidegger. They had this romantic love affair. She left in 1933. She was in Paris. She was taken, then when they became Les Salles Boches, she was taken into a detention camp in Gour. She came to America and accomplished many things. And then she reported on the Eichmann trial, which created this enormous controversy. So we did attempt a script where we talked about her entire life. But it was, as we've always said, it was like a stone skipping on the water. You couldn't have a real narrative, and you couldn't go into anything in real depth. And we went on a very long journey where we read also, how many letters, I don't think we counted them, but she also has many, many correspondences with Heidegger, with her husband, with Mary McCarthy, with Jaspers, with Kurt Blumenfeld, with thousands. I bet it's more than 2,500. I'm not sure.
But I didn't count them, but the Eastern archive counted the letters, so therefore.
So in any case, we also went to meet whoever we could that had known her in person, including coming up here some years ago and meeting the president of your college and her assistant and one of her biographers. And two very different women emerged, as Margarethe was talking about this. Some people said that she was an arrogant, rude, obnoxious woman. Other people, like Laura Jonas, the wife of one of her best friends, said, and her assistant Lotte Kuller said she was the warmest, most generous and loving friend that you could have. So
sounds like any of us in this room.
Well, it does sound a lot like what Margarethe was talking about last night, which is that when somebody is complex, you don't try to solve it and figure out which person were they. You try to find a narrative that will reveal the person. But you want to tell a story, but if you fail to illuminate her thought, you fail in making a film about her. So we chose the Eichmann years. For many reasons. And in a way, we came into it backwards because there was this enormous controversy. And for me, this is a woman whose life was very much marked by her exile. And she was exiled from her country, and it was very painful for her, particularly her exile from the language, which she wrote about. She has a great quote where she says, "The German language didn't go crazy." And then she came to France, where the German language didn't go crazy, as the country did. Louder still? Louder? Yes? Can you hear me? So then she came to France, where she was very, very happy. And then, of course, she was forced to leave that country as well. And being at home in the world, which is a phrase often associated with her, as well as das Mädchen aus der Fremde, the girl from far away. Being at home in the world was a very important concept to her. And she was at home in America. She has another great statement where she says America is a country where you can be a citizen without assimilating. And when she received this response to her work on Eichmann, which I'm making the assumption everybody's familiar with here, but she was accused of defending him, which was absurd. And because she reported on the role of the Jewish leaders that was at the trial, she was accused of being a self-hating Jew. And not only by the public, but also by people very close to her. And it brought back this feeling of exile in a place where she felt very much at home. And I think that our narrative is the 4 Eichmann years, although we didn't want to ignore Heidegger. And I think that when you reflect on her way of thinking, and she wrote in Origins of Totalitarianism about radical evil, and in learning about Eichmann and trying to figure out who he was and what could explain such a phenomena, she really changed her mind about the definition of evil. And she talked about the idea of the banality of evil, that evil can never be radical. It can be extreme but not radical, but only the good. Yeah? And this was a way in which she fundamentally changed her thinking, and she credited Heidegger with teaching her how to think in many ways. So he is in our film as a flashback, very much in connection with her attempt to figure out what the figure of Eichmann meant for the Nazis and the Third Reich and for everything that affected the world and affected her own life so deeply. But just a practical note, because you mentioned the word narrative, it is also a story that one can tell. She went to Jerusalem. She was begeistert by the phenomena of Eichmann. It took her some time to figure it out. Her friends argued with her. Hans Jonas argued with her. Mary McCarthy, her husband, supported her, discussed it with her. She had many, many letters with Jaspers about it, who very much influenced her concept of the banality of evil. You can see her thinking. And I thought, I read a line in the article that Mary McCarthy wrote where she says, it's called Saying Goodbye to Hannah, and she talked about watching her teach, and she said I can't remember the exact quote, but she said it was like seeing thought come alive in action. And when I read that line, I thought, if that's what our movie can be, we would be happy. And in going to the trial, in wrestling with the concept, in writing about it, and receiving this response, which was deeply painful to her, intellectually and personally, we felt you have a narrative that portrays this woman as a thinker and as a human being.
If you take the Eichmann years, there are the nuances. Since I'm not in the film business, the question is the nuance of portraying this person. So clearly, her investment in the having been through the Zionist movement and her quarrels with various aspects of the Zionist movement, some of which had succeeded, are interesting in her reaction to Israel in general, and also particularly her relation with Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor, where she had her own ideas, so things about her memory of what her life might have been like if Hitler hadn't succeeded is there in the figure of Hausner himself. But I do want to, and having witnessed her defending herself and being defended, Bettelheim defending her, other people attacking her and so forth, on this question, this thing about radical evil and the comparison between the Origins and Eichmann. My only plea is, as I understood it, now I'm not, this is no longer my business, so I am an amateur, I apologize completely. I understood her to argue that evil in modernity lost its radical face. It was no longer, and in fact, the German language did get corrupted by the Nazis because the linguistic euphemization of, that's something that angered her, of the Nazis.
Klemper.
Yes, also Klemper too. She's
Klemper,
one
yeah.
for you to identify how the language then is used as a shield to camouflage, to render it banal, to render it bureaucratic in a way. But the important message, and that's where she was misunderstood, although I have to say, having been a loyal defender of her and very influenced and very attached to, and as a Jew, as an active Jew, that she was angry. This was not a book written with detachment. She was cashing in on her own anger, legitimate anger in my view, against the blindness and the almost venality of much of the Jewish leadership. She never, however, lost her perspective that they were absolutely powerless. And in retrospect, she created what later became the research efforts of the Holocaust industry, in a way of research, which showed that she had underestimated the amount of resistance too. But the important point is the message she wanted to bring home is if people had only behaved ordinarily good, just decently, it would never have happened. In other words, if people had simply, the idea that good had to be extreme, no, that extreme good exists, but the real point is that if people had just simply adhered to ordinary decency, that when the doctor next door was deported, the other doctors would refuse to divide the patients among them, to make the loss of that doctor in the community interrupt the conduct of daily life, that normalcy would not have been allowed to take place. But everybody collaborated. All the peoples of Europe, with the exception of the Danes and the Bulgarians, collaborated. That the responsibility for the death of all these people was the Germans, but not only the Germans. That people adjusted in their life to deviate, because of the banality of evil, from a standard of simple decency, that the only way the world would work is if people as citizens could act without having to be heroic, sufficiently good to interrupt this evil from occupying and taking the place of normalcy. The redefinition of normalcy is what was at stake. And it was what was terrifying was the ability of people to render what was radical to our minds, that's the weird thing, obviously, ordinary. And that's what the book exploded, is the recognition that we in our own time, that the killers, later revived by Goldhagen and all of that that the killers essentially are all of us in this room. The killers are not some monsters that, that we can separate as ourselves, from ourselves. And I agree, it was very hard because the survivor community felt not acknowledged. In defense of the people who attacked her, having grown up in that community, the people that got out of the camps were treated very poorly. Very poorly. Look at the difficulty in the European community get the receiving money that they were owed from the Swiss banks, the looted amount of things. People couldn't find jobs, DPs. We think these people were welcomed with open arms. The United States took only 140,000 of the survivors into the country after the war. So the anger at then reading a book when Ben-Gurion had organized a show trial to show really what happened, to generate some real sympathy for something that everybody wanted to cover under the rug because everybody knew they were responsible. The British Foreign Office knew they were responsible. The American knew they were responsible for failing to rescue. In Avion, Hitler offered to take all the Jews of Europe away without killing them, and no one took them. The Dominican Republic offered 100,000 seats. So in this context, the survivors got angry.
It was extraordinarily bad timing because it was published at a time when I think there were just beginning to be more Jewish academics and more acceptance of Jewish people who were indeed treated very badly when they came here and were not wanting to speak of their suffering. That's true. Not only that, a big piece of the puzzle is that it was published in the New Yorker, not least that she would air Jewish dirty laundry in public.
There was no Jewish dirty laundry. This is a mistake. I have to.
That's the accusation with which I don't agree.
There was no dirty laundry.
However, she did say, and for this she was really insulted. It was the darkest chapter in the whole dark story, and I would say nobody's been more punished for writing one sentence than she was. And she spoke about that later. She said, as a Jewish person, the mistakes or crimes of my own people sit very heavily with me. But it was taken as an act of disloyalty to speak like that in the pages of the New Yorker at this particular time in history. And that had a lot to do with it.
The irony is that she was a Zionist. The other thing that's forgotten is she remained a Zionist to her dying day. A different kind of Zionist, but a Zionist. And one of the important things of Zionism is to show the world that Jews are not exceptional. She was ambivalent about this. She was an old-style German Jew who loved the exceptionalism of the German Jewish community. But she understood ideologically that they had to be normal people, citizens, not pariahs. Therefore, they had to be citizens. Therefore, they were normal. Once you accept Zionism as a basis, you have to accept that Jews have criminals, prostitutes, murderers, thieves, and stupid people. That was the hardest thing for her to accept. The stupidity was the one thing she couldn't digest, but everything else. So the thing in the Eichmann, you're absolutely right, what she revealed is that, in fact, the Jews are just human beings, and therefore, faced with this problem, many of them made decisions which are, like all other terrible people in the world, we have our own. And I great credit to my own grandfather, who actually was asked before Rumkowski to be head of the Jewish Council in Lodz. That's how I knew her, because he refused to participate and fled. And it was after he fled that Rumkowski was elected, who became the most egregious. Now, I'm not sure my grandfather ever thought that he really did the right thing, because he understood who was next in line. The fact that he didn't participate didn't make him a hero. He was just saving, he realized that doing business with these people could come to no good end. It was just intuitive. It wasn't thoughtful. You follow me? So she wanted to make an argument, but I don't think she ever, it had a Zionist aspect to it, which is the thing that's never talked about, which is to portray before the world that the Jewish people are normal, ambivalent as she was about that.
There is this famous...
Yeah, there is also, I think, an aspect in her looking to Eichmann that she speaks about thoughtlessness. And that comes then up also to Heidegger, because and there's a very moment in the I don't know if you know this the film The Specialist about the Eichmann trial. That's a film of one hour and a half done by an Israeli filmmaker, and where he put together certain moments of the trial, because there was so much material, but he chose a little bit in the way of the book of Hannah Arendt. And there comes a moment when the prosecutor asks Eichmann, did you think? And he doesn't understand. Think? Yeah, do you think? Think? It went in and off, and in the end, oh yes, I think. But just he didn't think. And this thoughtlessness, that is a crime, and was a crime of so many people.
As I understand from what you said up to now about the other movies, your interest goes into the connection and sometimes contradiction between the private and the public life. This was the case with Rosa, and it probably should be the case with Hannah Arendt too. And these two moments are of a great inner conflict, I would say. The Heidegger moment and the Eichmann moment. The Heidegger moment for a woman who is in love with German culture and German language, she says in... Yeah? Do you hear her? No.
Take mine.
You sure? So the two moments which I see is this moment when she leaves Germany, her very dear culture and language. In fact, to the end of her life, she says that was bleibt, die Muttersprache bleibt. What remains? The mother tongue remains. So this was, and I can very well understand this, her very inner beings. And this is a dramatic moment. The second one, when she is at this trial and she sees this banal, let's say, mediocre being and a kind of banal evil, which I don't know if in her mind, and this is a question also, she can compare him with the other one which was not at all banal. Heidegger was not banal. Heidegger was a very great thinker and remains as a very great thinker, yet he has this side, which we may debate or not here certainly. But these two moments are important. And there, in Jerusalem, he has a separation also from her very inner, deep, or maybe not separation, but a contradiction with her Jewishness. Because she suddenly faces this reaction of Jews against her way of seeing the trial. She is upset with the prosecutor also. We should say that Eichmann had a wonderful attorney, a brilliant attorney, which put the prosecutor in a very complicated position. This German attorney was fascinating in his not banality at all of evil. So these are things which maybe you are thinking about, and I wonder how this can be expressed in a movie. And selecting this period of life in America, I would only one thing say more about the radicality of good and what we can or cannot define as normalcy. Of course, the doctors should have reacted when that Jewish doctor was arrested and deported. But can this happen in Iran today? Or in North Korea? Or in any totalitarian state? Normalcy becomes heroic. The most mediocre kind of normalcy is a challenge to the state, to the way they impose a very rigid rule on people. People are afraid, and it's normal to be afraid. People compromise, and it becomes normal to compromise. And at a certain point, when the system tries to bring out from them the worst, the system succeeds. And the problem with this kind of situation is not to put human beings in this extreme situation. When we are put, all of us here, in this kind of extreme situation, we don't really know how we will react, and it's very possible that we will react not very wonderful.
Yeah, but I think, Norman, you put your finger on the crucial question. One of the most interesting areas of contemporary historical research, and something she suggested in her book, is that the Gestapo was not as efficient as it was made out to be. That the cost, the price to pay, and when the East communist regimes fell, they fell much more quickly than the population would have realized. That you come from a place, well, maybe the secret police was more effective, but the suggestion she made is that the price of resistance, that the Danish case, right, turned out it was impossible even for the state, that it had to have a lot of popular, her argument was that people wanted this to happen, especially on the extermination of Jews, that cooperation with the state was not only that I was afraid, therefore I couldn't.
But it was prepared by centuries of a certain type of anti-Jewish propaganda, but by a manipulation by Hitler in this 10, 15 years where he was in power. Of course, we can debate this for a long time. What it is to say, perhaps, that it is a process, and you spoke about the collapse of communism, and communism collapsed because even evil is not perfect. Because we humans are not perfect, so even the very bad side of ours is not perfect. It tries to be, but it's not. So, and the system collapsed in the end. It was a degenerate system. It accumulated a lot of contradictions and conflicts, and in a certain moment, in a favorable moment, it exploded. But it wouldn't have exploded if Gorbachev wouldn't have agreed with the opening. I know very well the situation, and as our good friend Lenin says, for every revolution, you need before 5 minutes of freedom. He knew this because they started their revolution in the Kerensky period, when they had this 5 minutes of freedom, and then they took power. And this 5 minutes of freedom, which came with perestroika, with glasnost, with all this, finally the system exploded, and it was unavoidable. I left Romania 2 years before it happened. I could never have predicted that it will happen. The system was extremely sly, extremely hypocritical, and found in 40 years a way to manipulate people and to make them totally dependent and to give in a state where the state owns everything. No private property. Everybody receives a salary from the state. The state owns you too. So this is the picture. And normalcy becomes something extraordinary. Extraordinary, and a kind of dissidence in the end. So, but going back to her, I wonder about this inner conflict in these two extreme, radical situations. When she leaves Germany and she thinks she loses her inner cultural being, and the second one in Jerusalem when she is in such a big conflict with her Jewishness.
Shall I start? And
Whatever.
Yeah? Is this still off?
Yeah, let's turn this. Can we turn this mic on? Yeah.
I don't see a switch.
No, if they turn on from back there, I think. Hello? Oh, it's on.
It's on now. I'm
talking.
talking. She's talking. Is it on? Okay, I'm talking right into it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I just. Yeah. Just one thing that you asked about. How do you tell a story with a woman like that? And I think here we're seeing the way she thought and what she wrote about. It was so fascinating that you're constantly pulled into these fascinating abstract concepts. And if we struggled the most with this two sides of her, you also struggle with staying with her as a human being. So I think that this question about the opposite pull of Heidegger and Eichmann, we worked very hard to create a relationship that wasn't a false and idiotic relationship. And I think that one of the hallmarks of her, one of the greatest things that she discussed so articulately is a relationship between thinking and evil. And Heidegger, whatever one thinks of him, had a lot to say about how to think, and he taught her how to think. And I think that we try to create that relationship, that she uses some of the philosophical discipline of Heidegger to try to come to some conclusions about Eichmann. But it's very important, I think, and one of the most courageous things about all of Margarethe's films that I admire so much is that you make connections, you explore the soul, but you don't draw conclusions that can't be drawn. That we try to explore the identity of the person and the way they thought about things. So people have criticized Hannah Arendt, tried to understand Hannah Arendt and her relationship with Heidegger, and the same goes for her work on Eichmann. We try to present it, we try to create the connections in her as a human being. And if Heidegger taught her how to think, then he had something to do with what she wrote about Eichmann. But it's very dangerous to get quite simplistic, also with images. In this fantastic scene that Margarethe described, where Eichmann is asked, did I think, and did I think? And if we cut there to one of Heidegger's lectures about thinking, what are we saying? Are we sending a false message? So we have to do it in a way that's more complex than that.
Yeah.
No, it's good that she's speaking about, because since now it's only a script, so that we wrote together, but to make the film then, that's still a very, very heavy thing in front of me, and I'm not sure at all that I will succeed, since now we even have not all the money together. But that is one question. That's a production problem. But for me, it will become a much bigger problem. Because to speak about somebody, it's much easier than to represent her than as a person in a film. So she's a thinker, and how to represent thinking in a film.
It's not easy, yeah. It's not easy to represent it even in writing or in anything else. I want to put another question which is related to her American years, because I understand that this is also in her American period, and I can understand her very well why she was happy here, losing a lot of bad things from her past, and mainly by the fact that here you have not to be in a certain way. You can be your own, you don't have necessarily the obligation to follow some rules. The students know this the best. But
even you're an American.
Even I am an American. But it is something there which you mentioned in a way, and you mentioned her contempt for the Ostjuden, for the Jews in the Ost, which is part of the Jewish German tradition. They were already very German, and these poor, religious, sometimes Jews from the East, from the ghettos, where they were ashamed of. And I wonder if her attitude here in America, towards America itself, from her high culture point of view, is not reminiscent a bit of this too. And I will read you a question and an answer which I put in an interview which I took Saul Bellow some years ago. It's a quite interesting interview. It's also published in this great magazine, Salmagundi. It's his very last interview. He was still very lucid, very alive, and they put him a question about Hannah Arendt. So I will read this question and his answer, and maybe this is worth listening to, even if you don't like Solberg. I speak first about his book, Oji March, and I say the book is mainly about assimilation and being an American. what does this mean, being an American? Hannah Arendt said at some point that to assimilate for a Jew in Christian Europe meant to take in anti-Semitism, to internalize it. This is a question which remains, I think, for all Jews from Europe, including me, but certainly with her, with Rosa Luxemburg and all the others. So I asked him, what did it mean in America? And he answers, well, I really can't see anything in Hannah Arendt's statement except a confession of the grounding her own anti-Semitism. I don't think he's right in this, but this is another issue. It's a very curious kind of statement for a philosopher to make. What else could it mean? It was her justification for her loyalty to German high culture, which is what she thought about continually, and she thought that this was her peculiar gift in her life, in this life, to be the representative of German high culture. To be a Jew was something to be given up somehow, for some high reason. Of course, now that we have a record of her love affair with Heidegger, again, I think he's not totally right here, but this is another problem. We understand what the reason was, but I'm not sure about her. I cannot pretend to understand her. So, this question about the high culture and looking down a bit to America, also as a kind of memory, the way they look down to the Ostjuden, to these poor Jews who were also cultivated in their way or illiterate in their way as the German Jews were, but it was a different phase of civilization, a different phase of modernity in these two locations. But is not this also a thing to take in account?
If I may,
Yes, you may.
If I may.
You are the president.
No.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. This response of Bello is fascinating. Several things very quickly. I never thought of her as a self-hating Jew. After the 73 war, for example, she was strongly, she stood aligned with all of the pro-Israeli, sentiment. She was absolutely, very angry, as many of us were with the occupation, but absolutely she was for within current politics, the integrity and the survival of the Jewish state. And there were many things in Israel that impressed her endlessly. Number one, she was not a self-hating Jew, but she was a very different kind of Jew from Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow was brought up very poor, had a deeply...
He was an Ostjud.
But he was an American born with a cheder education, real biblical education, and they hated each other when they were both on the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. They were the complete opposite poles, and so they couldn't. And it was false. He had a chip on his shoulder about his absence of intellectual education. So someone like Hannah Arendt was a terrifying presence because she read everything, including French literature. Her bias was French, Western. Was Western
Greek.
and Greek. Greco-Roman.
Greek, yeah.
You remember that Saul Bellow befriended Alan Bloom and tried to make himself a big intellectual through the connection with Alan Bloom, which was to Leo Strauss. I have to tell you, one of my fondest memories, and I wished I had been under the table, is to watch at the Quadrangle Club a lunch between Leo Strauss, Hans Morgenthau, and Hannah Arendt. And I wondered, what did they talk about? Now Leo Strauss would come through a real Jewish background. That way he was sympathetic to Saul. He had written on Maimonides. He came from real Talmudic exegesis. Hannah was with the Christmas tree almost. She was essentially an assimilated, but there wasn't one kind of Jew. So Saul Bellow, that was oil and water. I just think that, and I agree with you, the Heidegger relationship has nothing to do with, in fact, she was very self-consciously aware that part of the sexual power of that relationship, which was intense and never matched, in my opinion, by anything she did
And in her
afterward,
opinion.
and her own opinion, that had to
Not
do
that she said
with
that.
had to do with the extreme exoticism. The young Hannah, to Heidegger, married to that impossible figure Elfriede Heidegger. You have to understand, it was equivalent to a interracial marriage or sexual relationship in the Deep South in the 1920s. That is the equivalent. So the forbidden fruit exoticism of this relationship was incomprehensible. So it has nothing to do with her being a self-hating Jew. In fact, she realized it was her Jewishness precisely that made her so attractive.
Yeah, I didn't know these things about Chicago, but I said that I think he's not right.
He's
but
not right.
it's
You're right.
interesting to debate.
But they both came up from Greek culture, from Platon, from all this
Not
Greek.
Saul.
Both Heidegger
mean
and
Heidegger,
also her.
yes.
Yeah.
Heidegger and Hannah, yes.
Yeah, sure. Saul Bellow, I don't know.
Saul
But she even-
Bellow was very, very cultivated.
Very
I
cultivated.
must
Yeah.
tell you.
Self-cultivated.
Yeah,
but
but-
I had 2 days with this interview, and rarely did I meet a prose writer who knew so much about culture and it didn't damage him. Because the prose writer had not to know too much.
But he
about
overdoes
culture.
it. You know very well.
He
Some of those
overdoes
novels,
it
he
because
overdoes
he is
it.
also an actor
And he's defensive. He's defensive.
Yeah.
She had real academic training. So I think this Greek and Latin thing, he had what she never had, which is real knowledge of Hebrew and real knowledge of Yiddish. The real difference is that Saul Bellow was one of the great Yiddishists, and to her, Yiddish was an embarrassment.
And not
She even
only
didn't speak Hebrew. She didn't learn Hebrew.
No,
That's right.
but
No.
not only, because I asked him in that last interview what he is reading in the evening, because he was always reading. And he says the Bible, and I asked him in what language, and he said Hebrew, of course. So at 80-something more, 85, it's
She
not...
wouldn't know one Hebrew letter from the next.
Okay.
Well, she did go to Israel once, though, in the 30s. Now, come on. I just want
You
you.
know she was a Zionist, Jim.
Yes, sure.
You just said a prose writer can't know too much, and I think that it's really important to remember when you make a film, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that her being attacked as a self-hating Jew is something that was very painful for her, and therefore you have to show that. You have to show. I can tell you, I don't think she was a self-hating Jew, on a personal level. But again, it's not the job of a director, and certainly not one like von Trotta or anybody who's writing a script with her, to so much take a stand on it as to show how that affected her, and it affected her deeply. And
But she died in having dinner with Salo Baron, the leading Jewish historian in the English language, her close friend. She worked for Jewish organizations nonstop from 1933 till somewhere in the early 50s.
And she wanted to read a Kaddish for her German, not Jewish husband when he died.
When she was buried here, there was an argument that erupted between Hans Jonas and myself because she was buried here, and we had a symposium. And he and I argued because we insisted on saying Kaddish. And he was impossible. And so so that's exactly right, that the idea, so she was, but you're right, it was painful to her because it was actually not, we have such an essentialist idea of what it means to be Romanian, black, Hispanic, the reductiveness of the cliches which we apply. Look at the difficulty that Barack Obama has, right? So these cliches, you see when people said he really isn't authentically African American, he's even born in the United States, people saying stuff like that. So people, when they internalize this kind of rigid notion of what it means to be Jewish, didn't recognize that there's not one solution. So to that question, the whole idea of natality, which is one of the things she absolutely never was a self-hating Jew in that regard. Never.
I would.
You might just also make this point that wasn't just idiots who accused.
No.
No, there are some very good intellectuals. If you read the issue of Partisan Review, if you read that
It's a very
issue,
important letter, yeah.
it's a special issue of Partisan Review which dealt with this debate. I would like to open the debate to the audience if we have still time for some questions.
Like people.
And 10 minutes.
Say several things. First of all, I was at the Eichmann trial too, and I think that it has to be taken into consideration what the situation was in Israel at that time. She came into a situation, into a national mythology that said that the Jews of Europe didn't do anything for them. They did not fight, they did not struggle, they went to the camps like sheep. This is the background that did it for her. Today, I just recently went to the new Yad Vashem. She's not on the list of important German thinkers. I think people here should do something about trying to get her there. Pictures of all the German thinkers, and she's not there. But I kept thinking while I'm listening to you, the person who should have been here is Amos Simon. You know his
Yes, but he died. He died. We called him, but he wasn't.
He's sitting right there.
There's something to see that he left. He too was a Zionist. He left. This is a very complicated issue that you're talking about.
But if I may say, all issues are complicated. I think her not being in the Yad Vashem is, is a problem generally about this kind of issue. But, as you know, she was in favor of a Jewish army in the 40s and wrote very much in favor of it. So she was believed absolutely where she is in citizenship and the notion of this kind of, and I think that
She was for a binational.
She was binational state. That's the big difference, binational state. And the other thing is that the debate in Israel, as you point out at the time, the trial was created in order actually to foreground the Holocaust in terms of the future of Israel. And I'm not sure there was totally an agreement, but definitely you're right that the Israeli mentality, which you see to this day, is based on the myth that they never wanted to replicate the helplessness. It wasn't actually the helplessness of their ancestors. Yeah.
Anybody else, please?
I want to return to the filmmaking a bit more, and well, I've seen quite a lot of your films in Europe, and it's so important for you, the casting of the actors.
Oh, God.
And I just wondered what you say about the casting.
No, I don't know yet, really. I thought about to Barbara Sukowa, she was such a marvelous Rosa Luxemburg, but then sure, she's not Jewish and she looks not Jewish, and there's, I think there will being some spectators who will.
If you look for somebody who looks Jewish, you need Penelope Cruz.
No, I'm defending that is not my point. For me, it would be that you believe that she is a thinker and she is an intellectual. Yeah, you were very nasty, but I knew that from yesterday, so I'm fine. No, it's really is it possible to find somebody who looks a little bit alike, or it's more important? That was the same question for me for Rosa Luxemburg, because in the beginning I searched really also in Poland, and I searched an actress who was much more similar, from the outside, but I didn't find a person who could give this spirit, this mental energy, this intelligence, this sharpness. I think that is then in the end it's more important important to find somebody who gives you this side of a person than just looking like it.
Let me ask you a stupid question that I always wanted to ask a filmmaker, a place I take the liberty. We growing up as immigrants and knowing the subject here, I understand from your colleague that you're going to use the language that was spoken in the moment. Now the question is, the worst case was the Sophie's Choice. What do you do with people like Hannah who spoke English in an unbelievably, from our point of view, heavily accented? Do you make an actress speak
the way she spoke?
Oh my Lord! Because that's hard to do. And Meryl Streep, you remember that movie Sophie's Choice? And you have to understand, I grew up in a home where I heard Polish speakers learn English, and it was very good, but not persuasive. It was very good, but it was grating because it wasn't really. How are you going to find an émigré actress who speaks English?
Well, actress learns everything.
This is hard to do.
No, she when Barbara made Rosa Luxemburg, she had a Polish accent in German, and
successfully.
Totally.
Very successful.
So, and she's able. She already did it and said it to us how Hannah Arendt. She heard her speaking in English, and she is a total, very brilliant imitator. But not only imitator. She then when she starts to try to get in a character, then really she goes in, and that is not only imitation. Then it becomes her. And with Rosa, she limped also still 6 weeks after the film was already finished.
She sounded that way.
And
because we as
children,
children growing up with emigres, our parents would marvel that when we would pick up the phone with an emigre person, we would talk to them the way they spoke on the assumption that they would understand us more easily.
It's like when you're speaking with Turks in Germany,
that's right.
then all of a sudden
it's
terrible,
It's a question of assimilation as well. This is one, the voice is a very powerful instrument where you can, and also you can't help it, to mark your difference. I think when you speak, it's clear you are from somewhere.
No, but I have also heavy accent, but not as much as these immigrants in the first place, because they couldn't speak English at all then they came here.
They learned
Greek and Latin and French and so, but no English. So that was really, it's for me even painful to hear her voice. And I wonder, because then in this time the immigrants from Germany were a lot of them, but now to make speaker and actors like the Germans of this time, a very, very heavy accent. If you speak like that, then it must. You can also perhaps I think some people thought that she might be hard or hard-hearted or arrogant because of this accent.
There is a very interesting book that's been written by a musicologist, Clara Moritz, on which has a discussion of Arnold Schoenberg, which there are. That generation, this has to do with something which is a dangerous subject. The rhetoric and speaking style that we associate with Hitler, the kind of oratory, was actually far more widespread, with Mussolini had too, in the sort of public speaking style of the 20s. And many of the émigrés, when you actually, even Karl Kraus's readings aloud, when he has those Offenbach readings, when you read about, you think they sound very, then you put them on and they screaming in this punctuated, and you think, what does it sound like? Those films of Hitler, going berserk on the platform. And there is something to that generation, the way they lectured and talked, that it's going to be very hard to imitate if you're going to do it actually plausibly for that time. because we've gotten totally unused to it. You know, we watch those films of the Hitler, and because he was a great orator, and you think, what? I mean, he looks like a maniac. I mean, absolutely nothing. I know it's Hitler. It sort of looks like a guy who's gone. Barack Obama doesn't talk that. He would never have gotten elected if he started, you know, get wound up, his eyes bulging, and start, you know, who's going to vote for this guy?
The French are still doing
He
it.
never sweats, you know. This is not that kind of oratory. But in the 20s, this was the deal. This was what was mesmerizing. And so they had a little bit of them, the emigres, had this style as part of their self-representation. And that's going to be hard to represent.
To accept today, to make of her a person you really can admire or respect or go with her in her thinking, speaking this with this accent. So that is also for me a thing to, it's a real problem, because I would like to make the film half German, half in English, and when they are speaking German, okay, that's no problem, but then it comes up to English, and when it's come Mary McCarthy, she speaks American, a normal American, and then comes up and she speaks like this. Maybe that is rather upturning than that, and I don't want to make a film where I can't make sympathy for this woman I'm portraying.
The one thing about also Mary that Hannah Arendt is very important for the American context, you do this, the argument, is that she aligned herself with the anti-communist left in America. So she fell completely out of favor with what was a rising, liberal, sympathetic, socialist, communist, intellectual community in America. She was a pariah. She was considered on the right, especially around 56 and the Imre-Nagy moment.
Really?
You told us yesterday that you wouldn't make a film, but if you are touched by something, so if a person or personality touches you or kind of talks to you directly, and I would like to know, what is it about Hannah Arendt? What determined you or moved you to?
In my own being touched. No, I'm touched by challenge, because I don't know if it's possible to, and I did so many films already, so I could say, oh, it's my routine and so on. It's a person, it's really a big challenge to me to portray her, and perhaps I'm attracted more by this than,
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, she's a very enigmatic character, so I think it's a challenge how to tell her story, but her character was a huge challenge to pursue because she had these such distinct sides to her, and that's very intriguing. And that's when we're asked what we think of her, it will be always an unsolved puzzle. You do your best job to portray her and show her in extreme situations, but she's very enigmatic and alluring, and you could think about her for the rest of your life, I think.
No, I must tell you, when I first had this idea, or it was not even mine, it was of a friend of mine who helped me a lot also to make Rosa, Luxemburg and other films, and he said, oh, my wish would be that you make a film. And at the beginning I was, it's a shock. You say you can't do that. It's impossible to do a film about it. And then I started, and what I heard first was her interview with Gauss, what you mentioned, only on a CD. And that was, in reality, it was a television interview with a very famous then in Germany journalist who asked her, and that was her first really television interview in Germany, and I only heard her speaking. And I found her very antipathic. I couldn't, it was her voice and how and she seemed to me so always to be right and always to correct him. And I said, oh no, I can't do this film about a woman like that. I must like the person I had. And then I saw this television, the picture, and in between she was so charming and she was smiling at him, and all of a sudden it was both. She corrected him, but then she smiled, and afterwards he was asked what was, because he did a lot of these interviews on television and always Christa Wolf, all these very important, let's say, writers or intellectuals or so. And when he was 60 or so, he was asked, who was your favorite partner in these interviews? And he said Hannah Arendt, and that he fall in love with her, and also his wife fall in love with her, and so and he was all the time, he corrected him, but nevertheless he was so this contradiction. I always search also for contradiction where I can get both sides of somebody, and then it started that I want really I want, and she sure in this interview I won't go on now, but she told her story, and she said that was a line I remember well, because it astonished me, or it was also so true, that she said, not that the Nazis were against us or that they were our enemies, that we knew, that was normal, in a way expected, but that our friends all of a sudden found that Hitler was not so a devil, that he had also some good, so that was for her the real shock. No?
Sure.
That, yeah.
Anybody else? You wanted to ask something?
I was just going to let somebody.
Yeah. Please. Very back.
Just want to thank you for making those films.
Okay.
And what is your reaction? And what do you want people to react to after they see your film?
What again? I understand.
How do you want people to react?
Oh, perhaps like in a controversy. The film will be called Controversy.
The Controverse.
Yeah.
That book, yes.
The Controversy. Perhaps it will be that.
There was
Just
a book published of essays right after the trial called Die Controverse.
Yes, no, because all these controversial reactions against her when she wrote the book. And perhaps the film, I would be glad that he had the same reactions. So she goes on living. When you are polemical about somebody, then she will go on living. To be alive in your mind.
Okay, we thank you. We wish you a very good lunch.
Thank you.
That came out December very